Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the sessions in this other room here in the audio media. Let's kick off the conference here, and I'm very pleased that I have Gary with me today. Gary just flew in from Hong Kong. He is CEO of Terminal 3 and the chairman of the Web3 Harbor in Hong Kong, which is an association, non-profit organization that is looking into the developments of blockchain technologies in Hong Kong area or Asia in overall. And you have been as well the former CEO of the South China Morning Post. So as well, from a journalistic point of view, it's definitely something you can probably give us as well some insights about the major trends in blockchain and enterprise blockchain in Asia. Quickly about myself, I'm Dennis Flad. I'm the chair of the Enterprise Blockchain Working Group at the Crypto Valley Association. We are always looking for good enterprise use cases. It's a tough environment. We're going to talk about that in a second. In that context, welcome, Gary.
Thank you so much for having me. And thanks for getting lost upstairs. I assume that's what happened. Everyone got lost up here.
Exactly. Good.
Oh, that door's locked. That may be why.
Very good. Good. Gary, so what are the kind of major trends that you see for enterprise blockchain solutions in Asia?
I imagine that the trends we're seeing in Asia may not be too dissimilar from what's going on in other parts of the world, because obviously, especially when it comes to crypto and digital assets, it's also borderless. But there are three primary trends that we are seeing right now with enterprise blockchain applications in Asia. The first is very financial services heavy, and I think this is the boring part of enterprise blockchain, is a significant shift towards regulated on-chain assets. And this is being driven a lot by both retail, which has then led to institutional interest in exposure to crypto, and therefore regulators are actually spending a lot of time figuring out what on-chain assets actually will mean to the traditional financial industry. So that's a major shift, but boring. The second trend that we're starting to see is increasingly we're starting to see a shift to at least private-public blockchain, but a lot more enterprise activations on purely public blockchains. And that is relatively new. And because of that shift, there are several blockchain ecosystems that have a lot of exposure in Asia who are spending a lot of time on the core technology side building up enterprise toolkits and studios so that enterprise-grade corporate applications can exist on public blockchains. Mm-hmm. We can dive into that a little bit deeper later. And then the third one, on the regulation side, we have moved beyond just the basic regulations on licensing for virtual asset trading platforms. We have moved to more of the foundational things that make it so that corporate use cases can scale long-term. We're talking about interlinked network models, right? So cross-protocol assets, how do we handle that? How do we handle those cross-protocol ledgers? We're talking about identity, which is a big part of my day job. We are talking about custody and data privacy as well. So those ancillary, I would say, kind of M2 next level regulations is increasingly the focus of the Asia enterprise blockchain ecosystem.
Yeah, what would be, like, say, the most promising use cases that you see at the moment? So really for enterprise blockchain in Asia, what is hot in Hong Kong?
Am I allowed to talk about finance, or is everyone going to fall asleep? Let me spend like 45 seconds on finance, and then we'll move on, I promise. But I can't not touch on finance because not only am I in Hong Kong, and it is one of the great capital markets in the world, but that is actually where a lot of the foundational innovations coming from in Asia. And it is all about real-world asset tokenization and regulated stablecoins. So those are the two primary things, right? Security tokens that are regulated as securities, but they are, as you put it earlier, digital twins of real-world assets on chain, and also stablecoins that are not CBDCs, but actually fully self-custody composable stable coins that are tied to national sovereign currencies. And the regulatory innovation, are people trying to get in and they're just locked out? We can keep that door open. I certainly don't mind.
Yeah, don't mind.
Yeah.
It's not too much noise.
Yeah, it's okay. We're loud enough. Yeah.
Exactly.
And so a lot of the focus on the infrastructure side is going to be, right now, is on the rails that connect financial systems between traditional finance and DeFi. And it's so much more complicated. For those of you who are in the financial industry sector, you know, and Dennis, you know this because you've worked on this for many years. It's so much more complicated than just connecting assets, right? There are a dozen different things that need to be connected, and there are standards that need to be set, and there are regulations and policies. And so this is a lot of the work going on in enterprise blockchain in Asia. But beyond that, the stuff that is far more interesting. A couple of projects that I have been intimately involved in, which are actually growing to scale. The first is identity. Identity is so foundational to the long-term scale of blockchain for just normal use cases, and especially enterprise-grade use cases. And in Asia, there are heavy government initiatives to define standards for decentralized identities, or digital identities that are on-chain. And it starts and ends, I should say, with setting verifiable credentials that bring the concepts of privacy from the traditional enterprise and financial world into the blockchain world. Now, this is a concept that, as I travel around the world, I realize that the crypto and blockchain communities around the world just don't frankly understand that there is a big difference between privacy and anonymity. Those two terms, unfortunately, in the Web3 blockchain space, are way too often used interchangeably, and that is what gets us into trouble. That's why enterprises cannot actually take blockchain seriously right now. It's because we preference anonymity, and we say blockchain is all about anonymity, which is all transactions are public. Anyone can look at transactions, but you will never find out who executed those transactions. That's the premise we live off of in the blockchain world. Never flies in the enterprise world, will never fly with regulators, never flies with government. So we have to actually understand what privacy and the extension of privacy into the blockchain crypto world should look like, to be able to protect individual identity on chain, but to know that at the end of the day, those identities still need to be revealed at times for enforcement and regulatory action, right? So identity projects that are government and private together setting those standards are very big in Asia right now. We are lucky in Asia. I'm sure. I mean, I'm in Switzerland, one of the most advanced countries in the world. So I'm sure you guys have long lived with digital identities that are government identities. But no. There's no digital identity in Switzerland?
No, not really.
Oh, okay. Sorry for assuming. Well, okay, then fine. We are really lucky in Asia that in most of the advanced Asian economies, whether it's Hong Kong or Singapore or Seoul or Tokyo, Korea and Japan, we have long lived with government digital identities that can allow us to sign into government websites and applications and do everything on digital platforms. And we're now shifting those to decentralized self-custody. And so that's a huge use case that the moment you launch it, it's millions of people. A second use case is actually about licensing. We talked about this also downstairs, about using public universal immutable ledgers to be able to record ownership and provenance of assets, and then figure out business models around that. About 3 years ago, a archival standard was set out of Asia, and I was part of a consortium of people in Hong Kong that did this. It's now an ERC standard for archival assets on blockchain. And now that standard is starting to be adopted by museums and archive owners, people who own archives of photos, music, a bunch of other assets, so that a digital version of those physical archives can be put on chain, and then you build an entire scaled licensing platform around those archives. So imagine Getty images, but transparently on chain. So that's a massive enterprise use case, because we are talking about hundreds of millions of dollars of enterprise licensing revenues that can move on chain just in the next couple of years. And then a third example I'll use, and then we can move on, is supply chain financing. We also talked about trade financing a little bit. Supply chain financing matters a lot to Asia because Asia is still, big chunks of Asia are still developing, which means construction, as an example, is still a huge industry across Asia. The problem with construction is that construction trade financing is tied up in 6-month, 12-month cycles, and it makes it very, very difficult, especially post-COVID, for construction companies to do work because working capital is locked. One of the reasons why working capital is locked is because there is no standard to how you underwrite the quality of construction and therefore how much financing you can give to construction companies. So now, companies across Asia, and especially one in Hong Kong that is working across southern China, which is still a massive construction field, called Riverchain, this company, has now moved those indicators of quality for construction and therefore the data that you need to do supply chain financing on chain. It has taken supply chain financing from a 60-day cycle on average to 48 hours to provide financing. And very quickly in the last 6 months, already 800 different people, parties, companies, are now part of this Riverchain, okay, which is built on a version of Hyperledger. So the scale that we're talking about is reached at a far greater velocity with these kinds of use cases in Asia, it seems, than other parts of the world.
I think that is one of the biggest advantages in Asia that you have, that basically once you launch a solution, reaching the tipping point when things are really taking up and reaching scale is so much faster reached than whenever you are launching something here in Europe, I think. Because here, of course, you have much more countries, much more local regulations, and a lot of things that are making it a bit difficult to do. And I mean, you just mentioned as well the supply chain finance. And for me, as an purist in enterprise blockchain and a big enthusiastic person about enterprise blockchain, so honestly, I have to as well to say, well, there were great initiatives in trade finance. There was the Batavia or WeTrade initiative. There was the Marco Polo initiative, but they all got bust. They basically went bankrupt. And so I'm always searching for the things. What are the key success factors for an enterprise blockchain solution? What would you say? What is the key success factors for an enterprise blockchain solution?
I might be answering a little bit further upstream than what you're asking, because I think that the key here is what needs to happen for enterprise blockchain to scale. And I already mentioned this earlier, but what we're seeing in Asia that really works is private-public partnerships. I don't know if that's a dirty term in Europe and in Switzerland, this idea of private-public partnership. But in Asia, it's really the only thing that can move true compliance and policy forward. And for blockchain, it has been incredibly effective. What I mean by that is that the private sector comes up, oftentimes with the help of consultants, with a use case that is going to drive national economy. And then a private sector consortium will then go to government and submit this and say, here's a proposal for something that is good for our city or our nation. We need this roadmap of policies and regulations to make this happen. Asia is very, very practical. So when government officials, generally speaking, in the functioning jurisdictions in Asia, see these kinds of private proposals, oftentimes they'll at least consider it. And then when they do decide to act, that's when the magic happens. Then you have a relationship between lawmakers and regulators and private executives who come together and say, this is for the good of everyone, and so we're going to push for the use case. That's the way that digital identity has been advanced in Asia. That's the way that real-world asset tokenization and all of the regulatory sandboxes for that are being advanced in Asia. And even this trade financing or supply chain financing example. It was presented to government. And for Hong Kong, of course, real estate still remains one of the top 4 most important industries in Hong Kong, and arguably the most important thing that Hong Kong actually exports as expertise. So what Hong Kong has done is, as a government, they have gone to the major developers and said, and also the major banks that provide this kind of financing, and say, use this. Use this to spur the speed of working capital in Hong Kong, and then we can export this platform and our capital expertise to the rest of Southeast Asia, where Hong Kong developers and Hong Kong vendors and constructors actually spend a lot of time and energy. So that kind of partnership has worked really well, and we continue to pursue for new verticals of enterprise blockchain growth. We continue to pursue that kind of relationship with the public sector.
I just imagine how that would be. So we would go to the European Union and ask them to support something, and then, yeah, I think it's rather difficult here.
Maybe the European Union is not the way to go, but at the very least, from what I understand, at the very least, the canton governments and the regulators here in Switzerland are far more open to those kinds of discussions.
That's absolutely true. That's absolutely true. But then, of course, then very soon the reach is the problem. You know, how big is the network? How many participants? So we see here in Europe a lot of, or here in Switzerland as well, a lot of enterprise blockchain solutions that are just struggling with getting the reach. And I mean, when you look at the examples I just mentioned, Marco Polo or the V-Trade network, they basically went bankrupt because nobody wanted to participate in the network. So building up a network is always about reach, and I think that's definitely where the Asia, just due to its size, has a big advantage.
Yeah, I mean, China is we haven't even touched on China, where crypto mining and crypto trade is illegal, but people still are able to hold on to crypto, and more importantly, blockchain and blockchain advancement in mainland China is actually a national agenda, which a lot of people outside of Asia don't know. And China has put a lot of private and public money into decentralized networks for a bunch of very interesting use cases. One such use case, by the way, and this is also a public-private thing, is that in China, over the course of the last few decades, there's been an issue with missing children. And it's such a huge country, 1.4 billion people over this massive landmass. And it's been really, really hard because the registries of missing children and parents looking for missing children are all localized. And so finally, with blockchain, for the very first time, China created a national registry that is quote unquote private, right? As in, like, identities are not revealed, but is national and transparent, that allows for parents looking for children to effectively put a hash of their DNA on chain. And then for children looking for parents to put a hash of their DNA, and then it matches, right? And a lot of children have been returned back to parents they've been missing for decades because of this new registrar, right? So it is scale. The moment that something like that is launched, we're talking about millions of people participating, not thousands.
And it is a true value. I mean, that example really shows you that it's something new that was not existing before. To doing a digital twin of your DNA, basically, on the chain, and then bring that. That is a new use case. And new use cases are always very, very successful. And that's probably another thing that you can observe in Asia, because you probably have less legacy than some of the European countries have, and that of course makes it as well easier to roll out an entire new network and a new way of interoperability or workflows. What do you think?
It potentially true in certain areas, but I mean, there is definitely legacy in other ways, right? There's legacy in Asia. There's legacy in governance and culturally driven legacy that is actually sometimes just as hard as systematic legacy to overcome.
Okay, well, I thank you very much for this wake-up call as well for the European areas.
It wasn't meant to be a wake-up call. This is not to say Asia's doing better than the rest of the world. It's just that there are specific use cases and reasons why there's traction in Asia that hopefully folks can be inspired by, because at the end of the day, this needs to be a global industry. And so if Asia rises, it doesn't do us any good if the rest of the world can't participate. So these kinds of services for discourse from different parts of the world is really, really important. So I'm glad that CVC is happening right now.
Okay, great. Thank you, Gary.
Thank you so much.